outlook for Irish and EU lamb prices is forecast to remain at the high levels owing to the continued high EU lamb prices and the tight EU domestic supply, which is expected to continue and to support those buoyant prices into the 2025 year.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Each year, the Teagasc Agricultural Economics and Farm Surveys Department reviews the current production year and examines the prospects for the upcoming agricultural season. In this episode, recorded just before Christmas, I sit down with Teagasc researcher Anne Kinsella to discuss the performance of the sheep sector in 2024 and outlook for 2025. Our conversation covers key topics including price trends, changes in input costs, export markets and profit margin. We also explore the outlook for the coming season, the influence of international markets on producers, and recent trends in the global trade. And every year you produce a review or a situation outlook for Irish agriculture, and I suppose the sheep section is the one you focus on. How do you pull that information together, or where do you get that information from?
So for the financial analysis we conduct for the 2025 sheep outlook, we focus on the data from farms in the Teagasc National Farm Survey, the NFS, which have a mid-season lowland lamb enterprise. And the farm survey data are used together with data from the Central Statistics Office, the European Commission, DG Agri and Eurostat to analyse the financial performance of Irish sheep farms. We calculate estimates of the enterprise margins for 2024, which are based on the 2023 NFS data and together with the CSO price indices and the preliminary CSO price estimates for the 2024 year. And this exercise is completed for all the enterprise-specific direct and overhead farm inputs and outputs. And then the forecasts for the sheep enterprise margins for 2025 are based on our estimates of margins as calculated for 2024 and our forecasts of input and output price and volume changes in 2025. And we focus on the mid-season lowland lamb enterprise as it is the predominant lowland sheep system in Ireland, and in our analysis we have limited the farm sample analysed to those enterprises with more than 20 breeding ewes.
And that data from the National Farm Survey, that really is farms the length and breadth of the country, from what we could describe as good land to more difficult land. It's very representative of what's out there in the industry.
Yes, that's correct. The Teagasc National Farm Survey is based on a sample of 800 farms, which is nationally representative of around 85,000 farms in Ireland, representing farms across 6 farm systems, one of which is the sheep system. And sheep farms account for 16% of the total farm population represented by the Teagasc NFS in 2023. That is about 14,000 farms nationally. And Teagasc collects farm data comprising of financial, technical and demographic data through the National Farm Survey, principally in fulfilment of Ireland's obligation as a member of the European Union. But however, the survey has evolved over the years to cover economic, social and environmental performance metrics, and it produces a comprehensive list of measures relating to farm sustainability and other farm data, which is used extensively to inform policy analysis and many other research projects.
Overall, Anne, it's been a difficult year production-wise, but on the flip side of that, from the economic point of view, it's been fairly positive, both in terms of seeing some increase in prices, some reduction in input costs. We might just discuss that in a bit more detail. Like, in terms of your predictions for output this year, what are you seeing in terms of prices return to farmers?
Well, the price situation has been a very positive one. And of course, as we know, the Irish price is based on the EU price. So it has been an exceptional year with the EU market being characterised by higher prices that persisted right throughout the 2024 year. And this has been driven by supply shortages, which are the principal driver of these higher prices. And the EU market has faced strong global and domestic supply shortages, so that EU production has been continuing to decline in 2024. And for the first half of the year, EU sheep production actually declined by over 7%. And this was driven by the continued lower breeding sheep numbers, as well as unfavourable weather conditions. And disease outbreaks also in some member states affected the availability of lambs for slaughter during 2024. So for the year as a whole, EU slaughter is estimated to be down 5% for the 2024 year.
And the fact that we're very export dependent, with three-quarters of our sheep meat exported, particularly into Europe, that drop in production in Europe of 5%, that's going to have a big impact on our market, and has had a big impact on our market this year, especially the price that we're going to get back.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the Irish, we were very dependent on the EU market, and as the majority of Irish lamb and sheep meat are destined for export market, this reliance on the export markets means that the outlook for Irish lamb price developments on these export markets is critical in assessing the prices that Irish sheep farmers are likely to receive.
And certainly for any producers this year, we finished on a very, very high note, higher than we've ever seen probably previously. Is it set to continue is probably the question most will have. What's the outlook looking like for prices for 2025?
Yeah, the outlook for Irish and EU lamb prices in 2025 is very positive. Prices are forecast to remain at the high levels observed in 2024, with continued high EU lamb prices, and tight EU domestic supply are expected to continue. So that global sheep meat prices are forecast to remain high, with high prices in Irish export market, the UK and the EU continuing to support Irish prices into the 2025 year.
And if we look at the opposite side of that, if we look at the inputs and what has changed price-wise with them, and look at this affects right across the agriculture sector, not just sheep, and thinking specifically around concentrate inputs, fertilizer inputs, what have you seen in the past year, or how have they changed?
Well, first of all, if we look maybe at the gross margin and what we estimate to have happened in the 2024 year, they are estimated to be up about 1/5 in 2024, up to €831 per hectare. So this was very much driven by the high prices, which remained well above the previous year record price years. And input expenditure was also much lower, particularly pasture and forage and feed input costs. So that gross output was boosted by these input price declines, and also the receipt of the Sheep Improvement Scheme payments. So if we look specifically at some of these input costs, we know that purchase feed concentrate typically accounts for about 40% of total direct input expenditure on the average lowland farm. And in 2024, feed concentrate costs actually decreased by 8%. And this was driven by declines in the price of sheep feed, which declined 14% on average. But however, on sheep farms, the volume used increased by about 7%, which eroded some of the price gains. And this resulted in the overall expenditure on sheep feed declining by 8% year on year. Feed volumes particularly began to creep up as the year progressed. And for the second quarter, they increased by 1/5, so as to fatten the lambs to reap the benefits of the sustained high lamb prices in the run-up to the Easter period. And this increased volume use continued into the third quarter, with feed volumes up 20%. 26% on average. So that for the year as a whole, feed usage is estimated to be up 7%, well ahead of more normal feed usage levels of earlier years.
And that's probably a reflection of a difficult grass-grown year, and where lamb performance was certainly back in the year. So it ties very much in. Benefits, you said, of the lower price, but the higher usage has eroded most of that probably at the tail end of the year.
Absolutely. And this was also coupled by other cost component, the pasture and forage. And these typically constitute about 30% of the total direct costs on the sheep system. And fertilizer prices are estimated to have decreased by about 30% in 2024, while the volume used is estimated to have increased by about 5% on most sheep farms. So that overall pasture and forage costs were down 24% on these farms.
When we take all that combined, you mentioned the figure at the beginning there of that segment. We're looking at about a fifth of an increase in gross margin when taking it right.
That's correct, yeah. Gross margins are estimated to have increased by one-fifth to just under €831 per hectare, while the net margin increased by over 139%. And in absolute terms, this is an increase from €103 per hectare to €246 per hectare in 2024 for the net margin on these sheep farms.
I suppose we took that in context. Our output values have certainly increased, and that's been welcomed. Input costs slightly declined, but usage went up with a difficult year. There's potential next year, if we had a better season, that we could actually see a higher gross margin if we can keep our costs in check.
Yeah, absolutely. The outlook for input expenditure in 2025, from the perspective of sheep farmers, is that prices for the majority of our key inputs are forecast to either remain relatively constant or to decline slightly. So the total costs are forecast to decrease by 2% on average. And feed concentrate prices are forecast to remain relatively stable in the 2025 year, while the volume of feed used on sheep farms is forecast to return to more normal use levels, owing to less hopefully inclement weather conditions, while the volume of feed used is forecast to decrease by about 7%. So that overall expenditure on concentrate is forecast to decrease by about 7%. So with this and the more positive outlook for prices and the output volumes also increasing by about 5% on average, our outlook is that for the gross margin for 2025 will increase by about 16% to €967 per hectare. And this is owing to the more positive outlook for total costs, with a net margin also forecasting to increase by 54% to just €378 per hectare in the 2025 year.
And you've been looking at this for a long time. I think it's fair to say that's probably the high point we've seen, certainly in the last decade.
Well, yes, it's the most buoyant period of high prices we have seen, like the prices in 2024 and the forecasted prices in 2025 remain well ahead of the average price levels for the previous 5 years. And as I say, the outlook for Irish and EU lamb prices is forecast to remain at the high levels, owing to the continued high EU lamb prices and the tight EU domestic supply, which is expected to continue and to support those buoyant prices into the 2025 year.
And it's nice to finish here on a positive note, but I want to just contrast that trend to what we've actually seen in sheep throughput numbers. The fact that we're actually have less lambs going through and likely could see a reduction in the number of ewes on this year's census. It's an unusual kind of scenario where we've probably seen one of the more buoyant years, one of the better years for sheep production, but yet we actually are seeing numbers declining slightly.
Yeah, looking at the 2024 sheep slaughter story in Ireland, the latest DAFM data available on slaughter at the export plants for the latest week shows a 14% decline in lamb slaughter. And we see that the numbers across all the slaughter categories are actually down 12%. So for the year to date, our estimate is that sheep output volume per hectare in 2024 will be 10% lower than in 2023. But however, if we look at the 2025 year, we expect some improvement or clawback in that output volume, so that we expect a 5% increase in the volume of sheep output in 2025.
And certainly all that's going to depend on a good spring as well. It had an impact on this year's numbers. I think that's been recognised now. We look back on the slaughterings. And I suppose we always have to be conscious that, look, we are exporting into that EU market, but there are others on the international scene as well, exporting into it as well. I suppose, particularly here, we're thinking of Australia and New Zealand. What has changed on that side of it?
Yeah, well, as you know, the majority of Irish sheep meat production is destined for foreign markets. And in 2023, Irish sheep meat production, 3/4 of it was actually exported. And this reliance on the export market continued into 2024. And this means that understanding the outlook for lamb price developments in Ireland's export market is critical in assessing the prices that Irish sheep farmers are likely to receive for their output. France remains the most important sheep meat destination in 2024, with about 1/3 of all exports destined for the French market. And exports to the UK accounted for an estimated 1/5 of Irish exports, so that the UK now constitutes a more important export destination for Irish lamb, a slightly higher percentage than in earlier years. So with this heavy reliance on the export market, it means that lamb price developments in Ireland's export markets are critical. And the UK lamb market, along with some non-EU imports, which are mostly sourced from New Zealand and Australia, also compete with Irish lamb on the continental EU markets. So that these need to be taken into consideration in any of our estimates and forecasts for the coming year.
And just in terms of the rest of the global trade, I'm thinking here particularly around Australia and New Zealand being some of the biggest producers. What has changed for them over the past number of years, and what's expected for the coming season?
Well, over the past 3 decades, global trade in sheep meat has grown by a third. And throughout this period, international trade has been dominated by Australia and New Zealand, which are the largest exporters of sheep products globally. And this continues into the 2025 year, with the UK, Australia and New Zealand remaining the principal suppliers of imports to the EU market. And with strong global demand for exports from Australia and New Zealand, it is expected to continue with global demand growth exceeding supply. And as a result, world prices for sheep meat are expected to remain at their current high level.
Definitely something interesting to look at. Great catching up today, and thank you very much for that update.
Okay, thank you.
We'll leave it there for this episode. I have included a link in the show notes to Anne's presentation from the Situation Outlook conference, where there's more detailed information on a lot of the aspects of what she discussed in this episode with us. That's it for me. For updates on our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.